Imagine that you steal a pair of socks worth a mere $2.50. You get sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for that crime. The only reason you get sentenced this insane amount of time for such a small crime is because over 30 years ago you committed two other crimes. This is Curtis Wilkerson's reality. Now imagine being sentenced to life for stealing children's VHS tapes. This is Leandra Andrade's reality, who still to this day sits in prison from his conviction in 1995. He got life because of the three strikes law, which requires a person guilty of committing both a severe felony and two other convictions to serve a mandatory life sentence in prison. This often coincides with the mandatory minimum sentence. These two unfair sentences are just the beginning. There are also mandatory minimum drug sentencing laws that require courts to have a one-size-fits-all punishment regardless of the details of the crime or the offender's role in it. An example of this is to take a look at Kenneth Stanley's trial from 2008. He was convicted of conspiracy to traffic cocaine, trafficking by possession of cocaine, and trafficking by transportation of cocaine. His only role in the crime was driving the car. He never touched the drugs or the money, was unarmed and nonviolent, but regardless, still received 14 and a half years in prison. Some lawmakers have begun to urge mandatory minimum reforms, and even some states have enacted safety valves to prevent imposing mandatory minimums under circumstances where a clear injustice would result. But unfortunately, not all states have taken part in these reforms, and one of those that hasn't is North Carolina, which is the state I live in. The states that have enacted sentencing reform have been able to close prisons, save millions of dollars, and keep families intact. This alone should speak volumes to the states who have not yet followed suit. Not only do we need to urge that mandatory drug sentences need to be repealed altogether, but we also need justice done for those who still sit in prison for those unfair sentences they received before prison reform started to take hold. Eugene Downs. He was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 10 years for conspiring to distribute 50 grams of cocaine. The day after Eugene was sentenced, President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the sentence for distribution of 50 grams of cocaine to just 5 years. Downs still sits in prison today because the law President Obama enacted failed to account for people already in prison. Eugene's counterpart in the crime weren't sentenced until a few days later and walk free today while Eugene still sits in prison. President Trump has shown little enthusiasm for sentencing reform, which is why I'm urging politicians to move criminal justice reform higher on their to-do list. We need to ensure the prevention of future unjust sentences and ensure that people who deserve a second chance get one.